We've just come through the Thanksgiving holiday season. And now, as you can see all around you, that there is a transition very quickly, and some have transitioned even before Thanksgiving, to the focus on Christmas. But this evening, I want to draw your attention to maybe a holiday that you may have overlooked that is happening right now. And I'll give you a clue for those of you who haven't jumped ahead of me. Happy Hanukkah, Happy Hanukkah. So, it is Hanukkah. It is Hanukkah. Or as they say in Israel, Hanukkah. Okay, can you say that? Try, give me the little guttural sound. Hanukkah. Don't project anything to your neighbors when you're saying that, okay? But Hanukkah. And Hanukkah it's one of the most important holidays and most ancient holidays on planet Earth that Christians really don't celebrate. And we should. And we should. And I hope by the end of this evening, you will have a greater appreciation for Hanukkah and for its significance in history and prophecy. Before we get into that, though, I want to just share with you a few of the modern things that take place in connection to Hanukkah. First of all, there is gift giving. And in case you didn't know, Hanukkah really means dedication, and it's a festival of lights, and we'll get into that a little bit more. You saw the Hanukkah menorah a minute ago. It's an 8-candle candelabra, if you will. It's also called a Hanukkah. 8 candles. The center candle, it doesn't always have to be in the center. It could be on one end or the other, but normally it's taller than the others. It's called the shamas, and it's a servant candle. It serves the others. So today is the second evening of Hanukkah. Each night, they would light the servant candle in an observant Jewish household. They would take that center candle, the servant candle, and on each evening they would light 1 candle or 2 candles, depending on how many days in or how many evenings in the holiday has gone so far. So today, or this evening, Jews around the world would be lighting 2 candles. They would light the shamas, the servant, and they would light 2 candles. Last night, I was texting with some of our missionaries in Jerusalem, and they said they were on their way back from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and they had just lit the first candle. So it was kind of a special thing to hear that, knowing that I was going to be teaching on Hanukkah this evening. So gift giving is one of the major festivities in the modern observance of Hanukkah. There's a lot of celebration in connection to Hanukkah. Also, you say, what is that? Some of you got it. Latkes. Right? Or latkes, Latkes, or potato pancakes. That makes you happier, okay? Now, why potato pancakes or why potato latkes? Because they're fried in oil. And oil is a central component of the Hanukkah story. So, potato pancakes or latkes. I prefer them with sour cream on them personally. Also, donuts. Okay? Again, the oil component. Now, you just had dessert. Calm down. All right? Donuts. And you can see also some of the other components of the observance. They would call it gelt, which is a lot of times it would be chocolate that would be wrapped in like a gold wrapper to look like a coin of some sort. Gelt. It's a prize, and it's connected to games that would be played during Hanukkah. And you can see the dreidel that they would spin, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. So all of these are part of the modern observance of Hanukkah. But I want for us this evening to go far deeper in terms of our understanding of the events associated with Hanukkah in history and prophecy. In history and prophecy. I would love to be able to tell you this evening, because it's a Bible prophecy conference, to open your Bible and turn to a specific chapter and verse to talk about Hanukkah. But the reality is that I can't do that. And here's the reason why. Because the events that led to the establishment of Hanukkah happened during what is known as the 400 silent years. The 400 silent years. These are 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and essentially the start of the New Testament. There were no prophecies. There was nothing revealed from God through his prophets or through angels to his covenant people during this period of time. But that doesn't mean that there weren't very important events taking place for us historically, and particularly in relation to the events that would lead to the establishment of the holiday known as Hanukkah during the 400 silent years. So from Malachi all the way to John the Baptist, silence from heaven. But very important historic events were taking place during that time. So the 400 silent years. What's the time period that we're referring to? We know between Old and New Testament, but what was happening in the world during that time? The rise and fall of historic empires. The rise and fall of historic empires. So the story of Hanukkah takes place during a transition, if you will, or the events that took place during that transition led to the establishment of Hanukkah. Now, historically in the Bible, the empires that have preeminence and significance in so many different ways are Egypt, Assyria, and then we have on the screen Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Specifically, what we're looking at this evening in terms of our discussion is the transition of empires between the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire. Between the Medo-Persian and the Greek Empire. Now, at the time, historians refer to this as the Greco-Persian Wars or the Persian-Greek Wars. I selected Persian-Greek Wars because we have Medo-Persia as an empire that was established, and specifically during this time period, there was a ruler, if you will, who came to power, who was the head of the Medo-Persian Empire, and it was Darius, or you could say Darius the Third. Okay, so now I don't want you to get lost in history, but the history is fascinating, and I want you to stay with me as we move through this, because you're going to see the hand of God moving through all of these things, and you're going to see the wickedness of humanity through all of these events as well. So they had the Persian Wars, or the Greek-Persian Wars. So there was a transition, if you will, during this time from the Medo-Persian Empire, which, where is Medo-Persia today? Modern day Iran, okay? And the Medes would have been an area probably a little bit to the north and maybe a little bit to the west, but primarily Iran. And then obviously the Greeks, Athens, Greece. However, the area specifically that we're going to be referring to this evening in connection to this story is the area just to the north of Greece known as Macedonia. Macedonia, just to the north of Greece. Okay, so you had in Persia Darius III, who was the principal leader, the powerful leader of the mighty and wealthy Persian army. Okay, he was the leader of the Persian army, and he was moving continually to the north and to the south and to the west, all the way to what we know today as Greece. So the Persians were sweeping across the world under the leadership of Darius III. But there was an individual who was from Macedonia, and he was known as Philip the Macedon. Philip. And Philip had a passion. And you know what Philip's passion was? To defeat the mighty Persians. The Persians who had come up and oppressed, the Persians that had swept across the Middle East all the way to Greece. Philip wanted to defeat the Persians. But Philip dies, and someone else rises to power. The rise of Alexander. The rise of Alexander. And we know him, ladies and gentlemen, today, historically, as Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great. However, you say Alexander the Great, wow. He must be, 50, 60, 70. I mean, he must have a lifetime of accomplishments. No. Alexander, when he rose and began his rise to power, was 20. 20 years old in Macedonia. But he captured his father's vision to want to defeat the nemesis of Greece, the Persians. And so Alexander, at age 20, he moves on a campaign to capture much of the known world that was in many respects under the control of the Persian Empire, again, at this point under Darius III. I don't want to get too detailed with you in terms of the campaign of Alexander, but we are going to stop in a few key places to give you a little bit of color analysis in terms of what took place during Alexander's campaign. And again, keep our focus on where we're going. The purpose of this is to see what transpired in the world to bring the world to the events that would transpire and lead up to the establishment of Hanukkah as a holiday. Okay? So, from the area of northern Greece, Macedonia, Alexander has a battle, a famous one, in the area of what we know today as Western Turkey. And he moves over to this area over here, to the area in near the border today of Turkey and Syria, to a place called Iskenderun. And there is a major battle that takes place in this location, and it's called the Battle of Issus. The Battle of Issus. Darius III from Persia, over today's modern Iran, has come across, and they're in conflict, and they're going to battle at Issus. Now, Darius III has a much larger army, much larger, much better equipment, and the training is amazing as well. Darius comes over and he battles Alexander the Great and Alexander's army at the Battle of Issus. What's interesting about the battle is that even though Darius from Persia had a much larger army, the battlefield that they fought on was bordered on one side to the east with mountains, and on the other side was the Mediterranean. So it was a narrow strip of land where the two collided. And because of that, even though Alexander had a much smaller army, he was able to defeat the Persians and Darius III at the Battle of Issus in a narrow area of land because the Persian leader was not able to utilize all of his troops in that very narrow swath of land where the battle was fought. From there, Alexander makes his way south. And you can see when he's coming south, where's he crossing through? Israel. And do you know, ladies and gentlemen, that when he came down with his army, the Jews and the Jewish leadership were petrified. They were extremely worried. The high priest prayed to the Lord, and this is written historically. How much of this is accurate or tradition, we don't know, but this is recorded, that the high priest of Israel prayed to the Lord and asked what he should do, what the nation should do. And he said that he received a vision from the Lord in the night, and that he was to go out, and that Israel was to go out, and the Jewish leadership was to go out and actively seek to befriend Alexander the Great. And they were to dress in white robes. So the Jewish leadership in white robes went out in peace to meet Alexander the Great in his conquest with his armies. And Alexander showed respect and deference when he saw the high priest of Israel. And even to the point where those who were with him in battle, who came from other nations that were part of Alexander's army fighting with him, questioned him and said, "Why would you give deference to a high priest of a country that you're about to attack?" And he said, "I wasn't giving deference to the high priest, but to the God of the high priest." Now, Alexander, you should know, was a religious and politically savvy individual. When he would conquer different nations or he would go into different parts of the world, he would offer sacrifices to the deities of the nation or the location of where he was about to attack. Tradition says, and history records, that he went with the Jewish leadership back to Jerusalem and, on the instruction of the high priest, offered a sacrifice to the God of heaven. Whether this is all true or not, this is what is recorded, and it's a fascinating story. So, and Alexander did not attack Jerusalem. There was no big battle in Jerusalem, and he moved on down to Egypt, where he was victorious in Egypt. But Darius, who had lost the battle up in Issus, and the Persian army that he led, they had retreated after Issus, and they had gone back over to their homeland in Mesopotamia. And sometime later, they heard that Alexander was stirring from Egypt with his army and moving back up that area. And Darius III knew it was only a matter of time before Alexander the Great came after him and the Persian Empire. What's interesting is that, they didn't have all the maps and the information and Google searches that we have today. They had to rely on other armies or other conquests where things were written in terms of where the roads were, what the terrain was like, what the temperatures were. And they had to make important military decisions for tens of thousands of soldiers. Imagine having to feed them, right? Tens of thousands of soldiers. Make sure they had water. So obviously, Alexander could not just cut across the northern portion of the Arabian Peninsula with tens of thousands of soldiers. So Darius knew that if Alexander was going to attack, it needed to be up through the Fertile Crescent area, up to the north. And where Darius felt that Alexander would attack was somewhere in the area where the battle actually took place, and it's today in northern Iraq, near the city of Erbil, not very far from ancient Nineveh. And Darius III wanted this time to be able to use the manpower that he had in the massive army, which he wasn't able to use at Issus because of the narrow strip of land that they fought the battle on. So he created an area, smoothed it out so that his chariots could do their work. And he made it a perfect battlefield for his advantage, for the Persians' advantage. And he thought that Alexander was going to come over that way, but he wasn't sure exactly which way Alexander would go. And he wanted to move him to the natural battlefield that he had created in waiting for Alexander and for his army. He burned, this is the Persian, he burned the wheat fields, any sources of food along the Euphrates River, because he knew that Alexander, when he came over to this part of the world, he knew that he would need to feed his massive army, and he'd need water for them. And so therefore, against and ahead of Alexander's army, he intentionally burned the fields and kept Alexander from taking the route that they knew historically existed along the Euphrates River to Babylon. And so Alexander was forced to go further north, and Darius III said, "Aha, I think I've got him. I think I've got him." They fought, and I won't go into all the details, a major battle at Gaugamela. Gaugamela. It was such an intense battle, ladies and gentlemen, that Darius III used war elephants in the battle against Alexander the Great. To make a long story short, Alexander the Great won this huge, decisive battle. But historians record, and they disagree, they don't all agree on why he won the battle. But some historians will tell you that it wasn't Alexander's brilliance that won the day. And it wasn't necessarily a deficiency on the part of Darius III and his military that caused his defeat. They will tell you that there was an omen in the sky that took place before this massive battle. And you know what the omen was? They saw it as an omen. The moon turned to blood before an eclipse. And Alexander's men, soldiers, knew that it was a sign in their own thinking as an omen. They believed that they were destined to defeat the Persians because when there was a lunar eclipse, when you had the moon turning a red blood before it completely was darkened, that it was a sign that the empire that was in existence as the dominant empire was about to go down, and that a new empire was in the ascendancy. I'll just make a side note that is a very fascinating concept, because that is not the only place historically where an eclipse or a blood moon was significant in terms of the rise and the fall of empires. And is it possible, and this is just a side note, that before Jesus Christ returns and goes to battle to judge the nations, and before Jesus Christ establishes his kingdom on the earth, just before, there will be cosmic disturbance. The Bible tells us the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens shall be shaken, and then shall appear the sign of the coming of the Son of Man. The Old Testament writers speak of it as a blood moon, that the moon will turn to blood. Is it possible that it was a sign historically, and that God is using that same sign in the future to indicate there is a transition of powers on the earth, and that Jesus Christ will rule and reign? But that's just for a side note. Alexander the Great continues after his defeat of Darius III of the Persians. And he comes down to Babylon. He moves to Susa. He moves to Persepolis. He burns Persepolis. And Alexander the Great conquers the whole area of today Afghanistan, the Central Asian republics, and all the way to the borders of today's India. He conquered. But then he comes back in a full sweep, and he ends up back in Babylon. And he dies. Alexander the Great dies in only 10 years. So from the time that he rose to power, when he was 20, 30, 33 years old, he dies. That quick. In Babylon. He had conquered much of the known world, the Middle East, all the way to the borders of India, down to Egypt, Turkey, Syria. Amazing. However, he dies, and he has no heir. There is no heir to his rulership. So his kingdom was divided among his 4 generals. And it was divided in this way. Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucid took the area of ancient Persia, Syria, parts of Turkey. Lysimachus took Thrace and Macedonia. Cassander took the area of Athens and the Greek city-states. So Alexander's empire, after his death, is divided among his 4 generals, and they take over. But what you should understand is, for the discussion tonight and relationship to Hanukkah, the 2 that were most significant, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And you know what happened? Israel was caught between them. You see, tiny little Israel originally was part of the Ptolemaic dynasty. But there was this tug of war constantly between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Why was that? Geography. Tiny little Israel is the land bridge between 3 continents: Africa, Asia, and Europe. All of this is desert, completely inhospitable for armies, for travelers. But Israel along the seacoast has water, has food. So Israel was strategic between these 3 continents. And so between the Seleucids to the north and the Ptolemies to the south, tiny little Israel is caught in the middle. A tug of war took place back and forth. Who is Israel going to be loyal to? Who is Israel going to pay taxes to, pay tribute to? So Israel is caught in the midst of this whirlwind between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Years later, in the midst of this conflict between these 2 empires, these 2 dynasties, an individual rises to power, and his name is Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus Epiphaneus. He is a ruthless, egomaniac, tyrant. He called himself Antiochus Theos Epiphanes. And you know what it means? Antiochus, the manifestation of God. That's an ego. But he was, as I mentioned, ruthless, terrible, tyrannical. His detractors had a little fun with his name. They called him Antiochus Epimanes. Antiochus the madman. The madman. And Antiochus had a goal. When he rose to power a couple hundred years after Alexander, from the Seleucid Empire to the north. His goal was to reestablish the greatness of the Alexandrian Greek Empire. So he wanted to take it all. He wanted to recapture all of the regions. But not only did he want to do it, he wanted to bring the Greek culture, the Greek influence, the Greek philosophy, and the Greek gods, Hellenizing. So that was his strategy to unify his whole empire and to take other areas. So in the midst of this conflict between the Seleucids to the north and the Ptolemies to the south, and little Israel caught in the middle, there was a push from the north, from Antiochus Epiphanes, to Hellenize, to Greekify, if you will, the Jews that were living in Israel. And some of the Jews resisted it as much as they possibly could. The Orthodox. They resisted the Greek influence, the Greek culture, the Greek religion, the Greek gods, the Greek ways in which they worship their gods, which was very immoral, and there were sexual connotations that went along with the worship of a lot of their mythological deities as well. So there were some Jews that refused this, and they were staunch defenders against it. And there were others who wanted to embrace Hellenization because they saw it as a way to ingratiate themselves and to connect with the rest of the world, which was embracing Hellenization to their north. And it was a way to economically benefit the nation. So they embraced it. There was a high priest at this time in Israel, Onias. He was an Orthodox. He wanted nothing to do with Hellenization. But his brother was for the Hellenization. He was for the Greek culture. He was for the Greek gods. And they were completely in conflict. And his brother, who was not the high priest, but of the priestly lineage, his brother wanted a covenant with Antiochus Epiphanes. He wanted to make all Israelis and the Jews citizens of Antioch, the capital of Antiochus Epiphanes' dynasty. He wanted to build the Greek gymnasium in Jerusalem, where men would compete without clothes and bring in all of the religious aspects of the Greek culture. There was constant conflict between these two. Eventually, many of the Jews capitulated to Hellenization. And Antiochus Epiphanes now wanted to expand even further. And so he was on a track down to Egypt. And Antiochus Epiphanes, with his army, went to attack Egypt. And it looked like he was going to be victorious. But you know what happened? Another emerging power intervened. And the Roman Senate sent an individual, a messenger, down to Egypt and said to Antiochus Epiphanes and his army, if you continue with what you're doing in Egypt, you will have war with Rome. And Antiochus didn't want to give an answer right away. He was stalling for time. And you know what the Roman messenger did, sent from the Roman Senate? He drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus. And he said, don't step foot out of the circle until you give us your answer. And Antiochus, not wanting to stir Rome or the Roman armies, left, angry, humiliated, and left Egypt without conquering what he wanted to do down in Egypt to expand the Greek Empire. And Antiochus, furious, makes his way back up. He's got to go through Israel again, back up to his home turf. And what does he do on the way? He comes to Jerusalem and he hears that there is infighting again between the priesthood that was loyal to him and the Hellenization that he wanted, and between the priesthood in Israel that were Orthodox, that didn't want anything to do with him or his Hellenization. And there was a rumor that had started. There was a rumor that had started that Antiochus had been killed. And when Antiochus heard this, he was furious. He was furious. And all of a sudden, he says to his generals, attack Jerusalem. Attack the city. Subdue it. Destroy it. And ladies and gentlemen, it was devastating to the Jewish people. Tens of thousands of Jews were killed. Many more were sent into slavery to other parts of the Middle East. Antiochus forbid any Jew from observing Judaism. And those who did were severely punished or killed. There are many historical accounts of women being thrown from the top of the walls of the city. There are accounts of babies being hung from the necks of their mothers. And Antiochus Epiphanes went further. He desecrated the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. Antiochus Epiphanes killed a pig on the altar in front of the temple in Jerusalem. He stewed the pig, and he took the drippings from the pig and sprinkled them all over the Holy Scrolls at the temple in Jerusalem. Now, you have to understand, for us today, as Christians, we understand the significance in many respects of that. But for the Jewish mindset, for the Jewish person of that day, this was unthinkable. Do you understand that the Jewish people were unique in the sense, like no other people group on earth, that the presence of God resided with them in the temple, a house for God, the creator of heaven and earth, resided with the Jewish people at a house built for him in Jerusalem? The true and the living God, the only one true and living God, existed, lived, made his home on earth in the temple that stood in Jerusalem. And now a Gentile pagan tyrant marches in, seeks to destroy the city, murders, pillages, rapes, sends them into slavery, and on top of it all, desecrates the house of God in Jerusalem. Kills a pig on the altar and pollutes the sanctuary of Yahweh. He puts an image of him, his own god, Zeus, with his own head, Antiochus, on top of the statue. And by the way, if that sounds kind of strange to you, it's not at all. If you travel the Middle East and you visit ancient Greek and Roman sites, you will see lots of statues with the head missing. You know why? Because when someone else came into power, the head went off and the head of the new person put on. You don't have to carve a whole new statue. Just keep the same statue, just change the head. So it's not a foreign concept. To us it is, but to them it wasn't historically. So the temple in Jerusalem was desecrated with a pagan deity, Zeus. But what happened? There was resistance. And ladies and gentlemen, in this story, as in many stories throughout history, there is human responsibility and there is divine sovereignty that work together. God always has a faithful remnant on the earth. It won't be the masses, it won't be the multitudes, but he always has a faithful remnant on the earth. And at this time, ladies and gentlemen, when it cost them their lives, there were faithful martyrs within the Jewish community who refused to bow the knee to a Gentile pagan deity. And for many of them, it cost them their lives. There's the story of Eleazar, a 90-year-old priest. When Antiochus' soldiers got to his village, they said, "Eat the meat that's offered to Zeus." And he refused. And they said, "Okay, eat your sanctified meat. Eat the meat approved within the kosher dietary laws. But don't tell the younger people in your village. Make them think that you're eating pork offered to Zeus. But you can go ahead and eat the sanctified meat that's okay with you and okay with your God." And the 90-year-old man said no. I won't do it. I won't deceive the others in my village. They tortured him and murdered him. Or there's a story of Hannah and her 7 sons. She must have been an amazingly godly woman. And her 7 sons will go down in history as some of the most courageous Christians ever to walk the earth. When I say Christians, faithful to the Lord, faithful to God. One by one, they were tortured, one at a time, until eventually they were boiled to death in cauldrons. Their arms or hands were chopped off. Several of them had amazing testimonies before their death that are recorded in history. One of the last, I think the youngest, said, I look forward to the day that my God will resurrect me. And then there was Mattathias, an elder gentleman who stood by in his village of Modi'in, which is just about 20 miles outside of Jerusalem. It's an actual growing, thriving city today if you visit Israel. But back then it was a tiny little village. And Antiochus' troops, the Greco-Syrian troops, marched into the village, and they wanted a pig to be killed on the tiny altar that was there in the village of Modi'in. No one would step forward to do it, none of the priests, until one stepped forward who was willing to go along with the Greek Hellenization. And he said, I'll kill the pig on the altar. And Mattathias knew that if that priest killed that pig on that altar, that the soldiers would demand that all of the rest of the village partake of that pagan sacrifice. And Mattathias jumped up and killed the priest that was going to kill the pig on the altar. And Mattathias' 5 sons jumped on the soldiers, slew them, and from that moment forward started the Maccabean revolt. The eldest son, Judah, known as Judah the Hammer, he led a guerrilla-style warfare for the next 3 years, gathering Jews who were not willing to be Hellenized, who did not want a covenant with Antiochus, and who were not willing to capitulate to the Greek pagan gods and practices. And over the next 3 years, through this guerrilla-style warfare, miraculously, they were able to drive Antiochus and his army out of Israel. And they went back to the temple because, ladies and gentlemen, that's the first order of business. They went back to the temple to rebuild the altar and to rededicate the temple. When they got there, there were weeds growing up all around. There were the hideous pagan statues and idols that adorned the temple complex. They took apart the altar that had been desecrated. They rebuilt. But they had to cleanse the temple. The house of God had been polluted. Tradition says that they found 1 cruse of sanctified oil by the high priest. It should have only lasted 1 day. But tradition says that it miraculously lasted 8 days. And that the temple of God was cleansed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the events of Hanukkah, even though they took place within the 400 silent years between the Old Testament and the New Testament, they were prophesied by Daniel in Daniel chapter 8. Turn with me, if you will, to Daniel chapter 8. Daniel 8, verse 3. Daniel has a vision. And he says, "Then I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher came up last." Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to belabor this because we don't have to guess as to the identity of this ram with the 2 horns, with one horn higher than the other. The Bible specifically tells us later in the chapter, it's the Medes and the Persians. The ram is the Medes and the Persians. Verse 4, "And I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beasts might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great." This is the ascent of the Persian Empire as it made its way across the Middle East, as I mentioned to you before, to the north, to the south, and to the west, all the way to Macedonia in northern Greece of today. The Persians. And the leader during the time of Alexander the Great was Darius III. Verse 5, "And as I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground." Means he was fast. "And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes." Ladies and gentlemen, the goat, Greece. The he-goat with the horn, Alexander the Great. Verse 6, "And he came to the ram," Persia, "that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power." Alexander now counterattacks all the Persian wars, the Persian assaults. Now the notable he-goat, Alexander the Great from Greece, is now attacking back. "And he came to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns." The Persian Empire came to an end under Alexander the Great from Greece. "And there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand." This was a prophecy, ladies and gentlemen, by Daniel, given to him by God, about the events that would transpire historically for us, but prophetically at the time of Daniel. And ladies and gentlemen, history also records this tradition. Do you remember when Alexander the Great had won his great battle in Issus, north of Israel? And then he was on his way down to Egypt, and the Jewish leadership, in a vision given to them by God, went out to meet Alexander with great fanfare in peace in white robes, and that Alexander respected and revered them and went back with them to Jerusalem to the temple, and under the high priest's instruction, Alexander offered a sacrifice to the God of heaven. Do you know what history also records? That the Jewish leadership opened to the book of Daniel and told Alexander of this prophecy. And history records that Alexander believed that he was the one who was referred to in the prophecy. And from there he went down to Egypt and then went to defeat the Persians later. And if it's true that the Jewish leadership opened to the book of Daniel and told Alexander of this prophecy, and if Alexander believed the prophecy to be true, then he thought he had every reason that he would be victorious when he went to battle against the Persians years later. Just a fascinating side note. All of these events, ladies and gentlemen, were a foreshadowing of the future. You see, the events we just talked about today, that was history. That was the first Hanukkah, if you will. But the things that we just talked about, the Bible indicates will happen again in the future. And I believe in the very near future. You see, Antiochus Epiphanes was a type or a foreshadowing of the coming Antichrist. And there will be Jews who will seek to apostatize. They will fall away from the faith. They will fall away from the reverence of the one true and living God. And they will seek to embrace a counterfeit Messiah. And that individual, known biblically as the Antichrist, will confirm a covenant with many Jews. The Bible says for 1 week or 7 years. And at the midpoint of that covenant, that tyrant, that maniacal, ego-centered individual, empowered by Satan, will break his covenant, will go into Jerusalem, will persecute, and he will do something that the Bible refers to as cause an abomination of desolation. He will put an image of himself just like Antiochus did in some type of a rebuilt temple structure, whether it's a full, big, grandiose temple or a small, quickly erected tabernacle, we don't know. And he will cause the sacrifice and the oblation to God to cease. And he will demand that Jews bow down and worship. And that will initiate, ladies and gentlemen, what the Bible refers to as the Great Tribulation, a time of persecution specifically for Jews, and I believe faithful Christians, unlike the world has ever seen before. And there's so much that can be learned from the story of Antiochus Epiphanes and what he did and how he desecrated the temple. But I want to come back to the dreidel, the little top that spun at every household at Hanukkah in a Jewish family, especially with children. They spin the little top, the little dreidel. And you know, on the dreidel, there are Hebrew letters on each side, 4 sides. And do you know what those letters represent? These words. A great miracle happened there. And you know what Jewish people think today when they say that? It was amazing. Our history, we fought back. We threw off the Greco-Syrian oppression. We threw off the tyrant Antiochus Epiphanes. And we cleansed and rededicated the temple. And that's all true. But they believe that the miracle that happened there was that a small cruse of oil, instead of lasting 1 day, lasted 8 days. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you that wasn't the great miracle. The great miracle is that once again, God preserved his people. Through all of the Gentile world powers through history, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, it was Satan's intent to do one of 2 things. To either assimilate the Jewish people into the culture of the day so that they ceased to be an identifiable people group on the earth, to assimilate them into their culture and into their language and into their religion, or to annihilate them, to wipe them from the face of the earth. Go through the history. And why do you think Satan is so obsessed with either assimilating or annihilating the Jewish people through history? Because God sovereignly chose the Jewish people to be the vessel, the instrument through which the promised Messiah would be born into the world to offer redemption for all of humanity, and all of us should be thankful to God for his preservation of his people through history. So if you want to know, when they spin that little dreidel, the real great miracle that happened there, it was that God, once again, preserved his covenant people from assimilation and from annihilation. Thanks be to God that he is a covenant-keeping, faithful God.